Okay, just recapping the inception phase here in the RUP, and this is in continuation with what we studied last week about RUP. We have gone through the best, why it is best practices, the history of RUP, then the phases of RUP. We have studied the inception phase, and yes, right now, yeah, this is what we have done. This is 35 slide number. Okay, so the 36 is this one. So we have completed the inception phase and elaboration phase. If you remember, in the inception phase, we the outcomes are a vision document. That's a general vision of the core project's requirement, key features, and the main constraints, and the initial again, along with that along with the vision document, we also have initial use case model. That's like around 10 to 20% complete. Then we have is the initial project glossary, and then an initial the business case, which include the business context and so. And we also produce the initial risk assessment. Then we have is a project plan that shows the phases and iterations, and a business model if we have any, and these one or more prototypes. So that was in the inception phase. When it comes to the elaboration phase, outcome were very simple. The use case models are ready. That's almost 80% of the use case models are ready, and we also identify all the use cases, and actors are identified, and most of the description is completed. Supplementary requirements are captured, and non-functional requirements are also documented. Then we have is a software architecture description. That's basically talk about the architectural prototype and some revised risk list, while exploring the requirement, and also exploring the details about the requirement dependencies, and the other additional details, such as new stakeholders, his or her requirement, and the technology, and other new discoveries what we had in the inception and elaboration phase. So that way, the this will be continuously changing, and we will have to keep updating them. Okay, and then we also talk about basically a preliminary use case manual if it is the user manual if it is required. So this is what we have basically outcome for the elaboration phase. Okay, now let's talk about the construction phase. In the construction phase, basically, um, we are start building the components. But here that only will happen when the architectural diagram is stable, and we have already based on that it is presented. Based on the stability and present the based on the stakeholders approval, we go to the next phase. That's the construction. And while entering into the construction phase, we have to ensure that the system is broken down into the components, and also the each components are basically assigned some features or functionalities, and also we have documented the inputs and outputs of the each functionalities, and their dependencies and their connections. Okay, so that's how the basically the construction phase will work. And once we know all the components are basically documented, and then they are divided into a releases, so that the construction works will start. And once the phases are in the development phase, so the technical team, depending on the resources and depending on the team, it can be done sequentially or in parallel. Okay, and each of the components will be developed and tested and implemented, right? So the primary focus here, it is going to be managing the resources, controlling the operations, the cost and the schedule and the quality of the the product or the solutions what we are building. We'll also have to basically keep the management and other stakeholders in the loop through the steering committees, management committees, working committees, to ensure that if there are any decisions are there, those decisions are basically incorporated. And also it's not only incorporated, but the decisions are also basically the conveyed to the other stakeholders who are not part of the decision making process. Then we are talking about if there is any intellectual property or any patent needs to be filed or any quality certification need to be obtained, that can be done once the testing is done. Okay, so this is a stage of basically developing, integrating and testing, and again additional activities such as the trademark, patent filing or the quality certifications and all those things. Then we talk about the many projects are large enough in the can be done in the parallel construction, but again they have to be managed and monitored closely. Then we talk about basically a robust architecture and understandable. Uh, Hold on, there is some issue actually. Just give me 1 second. The robust architecture and understandable plan are highly correlated, and in what it means is that the plan will be in the sync with the architecture and again the release plans. Okay, and this is one reason is why balanced development of the architecture and the plan should be basically tested during the elaboration phase. Okay, so here what we need to do is a software product is integrated on an adequate platform, and the user manuals are ready at this stage, and the description of the current release is also ready. We consider a milestone during end of the construction is the at the end of the construction phase is a third major project milestone. Okay, and at this point you'll have to basically in decide if the software or your website or the users are ready to go operational. Now there is nowhere it is mentioned in the SDLC or this is what is going operational. This is something the problem I have come across. When we decide the operating model after the architectural diagram is done, so before during that phase when the architectural diagram or the prototype is accepted by the stakeholders and they will know this is how the solution will be implemented, number of the resources we required to complete to put this into the operations. But along with that we also need to identify the team members who will be performing a particular role during particular time. For example, you'll have to check at what time the data will come to you, who will be checking, if it is automatic checking, what happens if there are any issues or errors occurred, who will be notified. So you'll have to basically create that operating model and get the approval from all the relevant stakeholders. This is very important because once the solution goes into the operations during the deployment, at the time if this is not ready, then stakeholders may say I'm not interested, I was not informed, and oh, this requires additional resources and I need to plan for that. Not only plan, because if you're looking for the large organizations, they need to plan for the budget, and again if on emergency if they want to hire also, it takes the hiring process itself is like a 3 months 4 months, and once the person joins and then after that they will have to train and then deploy for the various other work, right? So this is what is important, is that operating model must be informed well in advance, and again it must be basically not only informed or presented, but it must be approved by all the relevant stakeholders. So this is what I'm basically requesting you all to understand this part, which is actually no SDLC has mentioned this part, and even in the RUP also it is not mentioned, but this has just come across from my experience in one of the project where this there was a confusion. They said at what stage you need to plan for the operating model. You need to definitely plan once the moment you finish the architectural diagram, okay, or once you finish the all your because architectural diagram is the one which will tell you what are the basically components are there. If you connect that with the construction site, you know, you will once the model is ready, so you will know this is a clubhouse, this is a walking area, these are the buildings are there, there will be water pump and there will be security. Then at the time you will know, okay, how many people we need, one electrician, one basically the plumber and one then few security guards, they will be working here. This is the kind of a register or the software they will maintain and enter all the records, and this is how we need to train. And there is a gym, and in the gym there will be the gym manager and there will be instructors at certain levels, and these are the equipments we need to buy, and this is a time the gym will be opened, but who should have the keys and how many people will be working, who will be responsible for managing the gym, you know, all those things have to be documented. So it is, we are not only just talking about the implementing, but we need to put that into the operations. So we need people and their role and the description and their readiness, all this is required in order to basically achieve the future state. So this is something which need to be done during end of the elaboration phase, so that you get enough time during the construction time to start activating your, start planning your resources and arranging that, arranging and training them, right? Now the evaluation criteria which I was talking about, all the stakeholders ready for the transition into the user community. Now during the construction phase, remember, if users are there, then they must be trained. If users are not there, then you have to hire them, train them, and basically they put them. But again, there is could be additional infrastructure you may need. For example, if you are going for a parallel operations for or additional operations, so in that case, if you want to plan for setting up some of the operations at the time, you may need to basically go for the office space and then infrastructure, you know, there's a lot of thing requires, and then your hardware, software installing, and then your rest of the planning is required. So, and of course the person who will head these all the activities, okay. So this is what we are talking about, taking from that, just building the solution to the operate from that stage to the operations, okay. And again, the last point, the RUP mentioned, of course, is the actual resources expenditure versus planned expenditure is acceptable. This is another the stage where you can check whether the expenditure is expected, the acceptable. It although it is very late, because we have already spent and we have reached to the stage where there is no go, you know, means we have to move forward, we cannot stop or cancel, but only things what we have to do is based on the budget. In case we have overspent or we have reached to the end of the our the limit, budget limit, so at the time you may want to think of letting go of some low priority requirement, or you can not letting go, or you can plan for those the requirement for the futures, you know, phase. So this is something which I would like to inform you. So there is a constant monitoring and controlling is happening in terms of the expenditure against the planned budget, okay. So that's what we talk about, is basically construction phase, okay. Now the next phase we are talking about is, okay, I'm sorry, this one is, okay. So at this stage we have to check the end of the phases. Is the product really stable and matured enough to be deployed in the user community? If yes, we basically transit, okay. All the stakeholders ready for the transition into the user community. Again, this is I just talked about. And are the actual resource expenditure versus planned expenditure still acceptable? Then next goes to your the transition. Earlier people would usually in the colloquial language they would say that, okay, um, transition, it simply means that uh, implementing or maybe putting into the production environment, but that's not true anymore. That's not true actually, because transition can happen in a different way. The purpose of basically this phase is to transition the software or the solution into the user community, so that users start using it. Once the product has been given to the end user, issues usually arise that will require you to develop new releases, correct some problems, and finish some features that you have postponed. So you try to basically reach to the end goal as soon as possible. And transition phase is also entered into the baseline is matured enough, so that at least the basic the features and functionalities are available, and it so that it is basically can go into the user domain. So matured enough means it has gone through all the testing, unit testing. After that there is a regression testing. After integration there may additional testings are there. Then you are looking at and the QA team is performing intensive testing, and then towards the end you may see that the UAT is performed and users have tested and give provided their sign off. After that only we are ready for transition. So that's the basically we talk about ensuring that the solution is matured enough. This typically will require that some usable subset of the system has been completed to an acceptable level of quality, and the user documentation is available, so that the transition to the user will provide a positive result to all the parties. User documentation is very important because that will help the users to refer while using this solution at the initial stage. That's your help document. Then we talk about the beta testing. Beta testing, if you see the beta releases which is not a final release, so you give them you release that into the users are exploring, and if they come across some bugs or issues or some things, they can basically report back to the developer, and developer will fix it. So you will find this especially in the Google apps and all. So there is a beta release, and then when the users, especially the techies, they provide the feedback, and using that feedback and the users feedback as well, so that the solution is enriched and basically you will see the final product. That's one way of basically releasing or transitioning. Second one is a parallel operations of with the legacy system that is being replaced. This is very important. Most of the systems are basically replaced, so you'll see that the old and the new systems are running parallelly till the new system stabilizes in the operation environment, or the you can call it the production environment. When you find there is a users are settled down, there are no longer any issues with the system, then you can slowly remove the old system. Then we talk about the conversation of the operational database. What do you mean by conversation of operational database? Is basically if you are migrating the database, then you may required to go through this process. The training of the users and maintenance. So this is basically way before the transition. uh, you may have to provide the training to the users and the maintainers, so that the system is stabilizes well in the production environment, and it has been easily used by both the users. Okay. Then comes to the rollout the product to the marketing, distribution, and the sales team. This was basically earlier, if you remember that this is for the product. The earlier days, the products were basically stored on CDs, and the CD would get packaged and then released across the world. Now most of the releases are basically online, so you will find those are basically uploaded, and then users simply download and pay the amount and get it activated, right? So that's how the releases are happening. So the last line is basically the coming from the old style. So this is your transition, but of course there is little more to it. So the phase is basically focusing, this particular phase is focusing on the activities that required to place the software solution into the hands of the users. So you'll have to ensure that it is the smooth transition is and then typically this phase includes several iterations including beta release, general availability releases, as well as bug fixes, enhancement releases. So that's a typical activities will happen during the initial days. The reason is the solution, when it is built and tested, it's in a secluded environment, but when it goes into the production environment, it start interacting with the users as well as with other systems, with the real time databases. And so you'll the system will the newly built system will go through various scenarios which may not have been captured or been tested. So at the time the system, you may come across some the issues and the bug fixes breaking down the system. So those have to be captured and fixed immediately, so that so that the system becomes stable in the user community. Considerable effort is extended in developing the user oriented documentation, training users, supporting users in their initial product use, and reacting to the user feedbacks is important. At this point, basically, the user feedback will be confined primarily related to the product tuning, configuration, installation, and usability issues. The milestone of for this transition phase will have achieving the user self supportability, so that the solution stabilizes in the user community, and user also are familiar with the solution and are able to handle themselves, so they no longer need to call the technical team for the help. Then achieving the stakeholder concurrence, this is important basically, that the development baselines are complete and consistent with the evaluation criteria of the vision document. So when you think that a stakeholder agrees that the solution has reached to the its minimum requirement, so that they can provide the sign off. Usually this project there are some documentations are there. Post project there are documentation, we need to close them and get the user feedback, and that we require to submit. Then we have is achieving the final product baseline and the cost effectively as practical. Now, as we already seen, we first start with the project baseline and high priority requirements, and some of the requirement goes into the second or the third phase. So those we need to basically complete at the earliest and ensure that the product is basically uh, uh, is suitable and well and it is appropriate to the use, and also it achieves the organization as well as stakeholders objectives. So this phase can be a simple or it can be extremely complex depending on the complexity of the solution. Okay, sometime it may take about like a week, sometime it may take a 3 to 4 months as well. So depending on the complexity, you may find this transition can be equally complex. Okay. The milestone, how do you know we have reached to the milestone is we obtain the user the feedback, positive feedback, that is users are satisfied, and then we also talk about actual resource expenditure versus planned expenditure is still acceptable. Sometimes we must have spent little more, so that is still acceptable. If it is yes, then we go ahead. Okay, so this is what all about your RUP. Any questions you have? No. All right. And here it is a diagram which talks about the milestones achieved. Here you see that inception phase, life cycle objectives, and elaboration architecture, construction phase, initial operational capabilities, transition phase is product release. Okay, so these are the milestone. Okay, so then now we will have is agile methodologies. I'm just going to give you the heads up now, the agile. Uh, Many people I come across, they consider that agile is a kind of, one simple methodology, and they are actually talking about Scrum. But agile is a project management approach, but it is basically used in the software development. But remember that it's a group of methodologies, it's not one. Okay, it's a group of methodologies, and they are based on the principle of iterative development, which where the requirements evolves through collaboration between self-organizing cross-functional team. Now this is important, last part is evolves through the collaboration between self-organizing cross-functional team. So you will find how this is happening. We will just see some of the characteristics. One more point I missed out here is agile methodologies basically will help the team to respond to the unpredictability of the building software through incremental iterative work cadence known as sprints. Here the sprint is nothing but iterations. Okay, sprint, the terminology is primarily used in Scrum. So you will find the sprint or the iteration is basically consist of 3 to 4 weeks of a work. Okay, and that is how the product or the solution is built sprint by sprint. If you see the honeycomb, if you remember, if you recollect how the honeycomb looks like, there are some sockets are there where the honey is basically stored. So you can consider each socket is like a sprint. So that is how we build the sprint by sprint, and we put them together, and later on you get the complete picture. Okay. All right, I think there's some issues with the slide. Let me just give you a quick heads up, because we are going to only learn. Uh-huh. Okay, I'm just going to stop this one.